This is Craziest HOA Moments. The HOA made it personal, and I made it documented. You have 1 minute to show proof. That was Stephanie Kelly, Vice President of the Riverbend Estates Association, standing on my driveway at 6:45 in the morning, waving a thick ledger printout like it was a court summons. She held the stack in one hand and a coffee tumbler in the other, the tumbler positioned like a prop to show she was ready to wait me out. Her white visor caught the early light, and her blonde ponytail swung as she leaned forward. I am a court runner who files documents and knows deadlines, so I recognized the tactic immediately. She was trying to run the clock on me before I could think. I stood there in my tan work shirt with my green trucker cap pulled low, a small notepad with wet pages in my hand from the dew that had soaked the mailbox cluster. My key ring jangled as I shifted my weight. I had been up since 5 preparing for this exact moment, but she did not know that yet. The dew on the grass showed footprints leading from her car to my driveway, and a teen on a bike had already braked hard at the corner to watch the argument unfold. Stephanie slammed the ledger printout against her palm. The numbers were final, she said, and I was not allowed to verify them. She had a plastic evidence sleeve in her other hand now, waving it like it proved everything. I did not take the bait. I just held up my tabbed evidence binder and kept my voice level. I told her I had already verified the numbers, and they did not match the minutes from the vote. She screamed that the minutes were not my business and that I was wasting HOA time. Behind her, the teen on the bike rolled closer, phone out recording. I saw neighbors starting to come out onto their porches. This was Riverbend Estates, Spokane, Washington, a place where gray areas equal HOA power grabs, and Stephanie had built a career on exploiting those gray areas. She had been vice president for 3 years, and in that time she had mastered the art of selective enforcement and backdated paperwork. I had ignored it until now because I had bigger problems. I am in a custody and visitation routine, and the HOA kept targeting my schedule and guests with new rules that appeared overnight. But 3 days ago, a committee chair had pulled me aside at the mailbox cluster and told me quietly that the file cabinet was missing a folder from the year of the incident. The incident was a towing enforcement action from 18 months back, one that had hit half the street with fines and tow threats. The folder was supposed to contain the board vote authorizing the enforcement policy. Without that folder, the fines were invalid. I asked why it mattered now, and the committee chair just shook his head and said Stephanie had been asking about the folder that morning. That was when I knew. The cold case was not cold. It was active, and it was about to target me again. Stephanie stepped closer, her voice rising. She said I had 1 minute to show proof that I had paid the administrative fee for the records request, or she was filing a new fine right now. I pulled out my phone and showed her the bank transaction from 2 weeks ago. She barely looked at it. She said the fee structure had changed last month and I needed to resubmit with the updated amount. I asked where the updated fee schedule was posted. She waved the plastic evidence sleeve again and said it was in the portal, which I knew was a lie because I checked the portal every morning. The teen on the bike called out asking if everything was okay. Stephanie whipped around and told him to leave or she would call his parents. He did not move. She turned back to me, her face red now, and said she did not care what I thought. She cared what the rules said. That line again. She had used it on me twice before, and both times it had been a prelude to moving the goalposts. I acted like I was backing down, because timing was the whole weapon. I told her I would resubmit the fee and asked for the invoice. She said the invoice would be mailed within 10 business days. I said that was fine, but I needed confirmation in writing that my original request was still active. She said no. She said the request had expired when I failed to pay the correct fee, and I would need to start over. That was the moment I knew she was trying to bury the folder permanently. I told Stephanie I would be at the management office when they opened at 9. She said the management office did not handle records requests anymore. I asked who did. She said the board secretary, who only worked Thursdays. Today was Monday. I asked for the secretary's email. She said the secretary did not use email for HOA business. I asked how I was supposed to submit the request. She said by mail, certified with the updated fee, and it would be processed in the order received. That was 3 goalposts moved in under 2 minutes. I stayed calm. I thanked her for the clarification and said I would follow the process exactly. She looked confused for a second, like she had expected me to yell. Then she smiled, a cold, tight smile, and said good. She said she was glad I was finally learning how things worked in Riverbend Estates. She turned to leave, then stopped and looked back. She said the tow vendor wanted authorization now for a vehicle parked in my driveway overnight, and she was going to provide it unless I could show proof of a guest pass by noon. I asked what vehicle. She pointed at my friend's car, the accountant who had been helping me spot the red flags in the HOA ledger. I asked when the overnight guest pass rule had started. She said last month. I asked where it was posted. She said in the minutes. I asked which meeting. She said the September meeting. I pulled out my binder and flipped to the September minutes. There was no mention of a guest pass rule. I showed her the page. She glanced at it and said that was the draft minutes, not the final minutes. I asked where the final minutes were. She said they were being finalized. The teen on the bike laughed. Stephanie whipped around again, her face now fully red, and screamed at him to get lost or she would have his bike towed too. The kid rolled backwards slowly, still recording. A neighbor across the street opened her door and stepped out onto her porch, arms crossed. Stephanie noticed and lowered her voice. She told me the tow truck was already on standby and if I did not have a guest pass by noon, the car would be gone. Then she walked back to her car, ledger printout tucked under her arm, coffee tumbler held high. I stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline settle. The neighbor across the street gave me a small nod, then went back inside. The teen on the bike rode off, phone still in hand. I went inside and called my friend, the accountant. I told him to move his car immediately and to send me every email and text he had ever received from the HOA. He asked why. I told him I was reopening a cold case and I needed his help to connect the dots. The cold case was the towing enforcement action from 18 months ago. It had started with a letter to every household on our street saying that the board had voted to authorize a new towing policy for overnight parking violations. The letter included a deadline, a fine schedule, and the name of the contracted tow vendor. 3 days later, cars started getting towed. People were furious. The fines were $250 per vehicle, plus the tow fee, plus a $50 administrative fee to appeal. Half the street paid. The other half fought. I had been one of the ones who fought. I filed a dispute packet with the management company, asking for a copy of the board vote and the quorum log. The management company lost my packet. I refiled. They lost it again. After the 3rd time, I gave up and paid the fine because I could not afford to miss work for a hearing. But I never forgot. I saved every email, every letter, every receipt. And now, 18 months later, the committee chair had told me the folder was missing. I spent the rest of Monday morning digging through my files. I found the original enforcement letter, the fine notice, the tow receipt, and the denial of my appeal. I found the emails from the management company saying they could not locate my dispute packet. I found the payment confirmation for the $250, and I found something else. The enforcement letter was dated August 15th, but the board meeting minutes from August showed no vote on a towing policy. The minutes listed a vote on landscaping, a vote on pool hours, and a vote on dues, but nothing about towing. I pulled up the meeting video. Riverbend Estates recorded every board meeting and posted the videos in the portal. The August meeting video was 1 hour and 12 minutes long. I watched the whole thing. There was no discussion of towing. There was no vote. The minutes matched the video exactly. The towing policy had never been voted on. I called my friend, the accountant. I told him what I had found. He went quiet for a moment, then asked if I had checked the July minutes. I had not. I pulled them up. July minutes showed a vote to authorize the board to develop a towing policy, but no vote to implement it. August had no vote. September had no vote. The policy had been enforced without a board vote. My friend asked if I had checked the quorum logs. I had not even thought of that. He explained that every board vote required a quorum, and the quorum log was supposed to be attached to the minutes. If the log was missing, the vote was invalid. I pulled up the July minutes again. No quorum log. I pulled up August, September, October. No quorum logs anywhere. I asked him what that meant. He said it meant either the quorum logs were filed separately or they did not exist. If they did not exist, every vote in the portal was potentially invalid. I asked how that was possible. He said it was possible if the person uploading the minutes was skipping steps on purpose. That was when I understood. This was not a mistake. This was a scheme. Someone had been uploading incomplete minutes, enforcing policies that were never voted on, and collecting fines that were never authorized. And the missing folder was the smoking gun. I asked my friend if he could pull the HOA ledger and cross-reference the fine revenue with the meeting minutes. He said he could, but it would take a few days. I told him I did not have a few days. Stephanie was trying to tow my friend's car by noon, and if I did not stop her, she would bury the folder and the case would stay cold forever. I called the tow vendor. I got the dispatcher on the line and asked if they had received an authorization to tow a vehicle from my address. The dispatcher said yes. The authorization had come in at 7 that morning. I asked who had authorized it. The dispatcher said the HOA vice president. I asked if the authorization included a copy of the violation notice and the board policy. The dispatcher paused, then said no. I told the dispatcher that the policy had never been voted on and that any tow without a valid policy was illegal. The dispatcher said that was between me and the HOA. I told the dispatcher I was putting them on notice right now that the tow was invalid, and if they proceeded, I would file a complaint with the city and the state licensing board. The dispatcher went quiet. Then she said she would flag the authorization as disputed and put the tow on hold until the HOA provided documentation. I thanked her and hung up. I immediately sent an email to Stephanie, copying the management company and the board president, summarizing the call and demanding a copy of the board vote authorizing the towing policy. I attached the August minutes and the meeting video link. I hit send. 10 minutes later, Stephanie called me. She was screaming before I even said hello. She said I had no right to interfere with HOA enforcement. She said the tow vendor had called her, and she was filing a harassment complaint against me. She said I was going to be fined $500 for obstruction. I asked where the obstruction rule was in the covenants. She said it was an administrative rule. I asked when it was voted on. She said it did not need to be voted on. I asked who had the authority to create administrative rules. She said the board did. I asked for the minutes showing the board vote to grant that authority. She hung up. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone. My hands were shaking. I had just triggered something big and I did not know where it would land, but I knew one thing: Stephanie was panicking. And when people panic, they make mistakes. By noon, I had received 3 emails. The first was from the management company, saying they had forwarded my request to the board secretary. The second was from the board secretary, saying she would need 2 weeks to compile the records. The third was from Stephanie, saying my obstruction fine had been increased to $750 and that I was now banned from attending board meetings until the fine was paid. I forwarded all 3 emails to my friend, the accountant. He called me immediately. He said the obstruction fine was retaliation, and retaliation was illegal under Washington State HOA law. He said I should file a complaint with the state attorney general and copy the management company. I asked if that would make things worse. He said it could not get worse. Stephanie was already trying to bury me. The only way forward was to force transparency. I drafted the complaint that afternoon. I kept it short and factual. I listed the missing quorum logs, the unvoted towing policy, the moving goalposts on the records request, and the retaliatory obstruction fine. I attached the emails, the meeting minutes, the video links, and the payment receipts. I sent it to the Attorney General, the management company, the board president, and every board member whose email I could find. I copied Stephanie last. 2 hours later, the board president called me. His name was Ron, and he sounded exhausted. He said he had just read my complaint and he needed to understand what I was asking for. I told him I wanted 3 things. 1, a copy of the board vote authorizing the towing policy. 2, a full audit of the quorum logs for the past 2 years. 3, a reversal of the obstruction fine and a formal apology. Ron sighed. He said he did not know anything about a missing folder, and he did not know why the quorum logs were not attached to the minutes. He said Stephanie handled the records and he trusted her to follow the process. I asked if he had ever verified that she was following the process. He said no. I asked why not. He said because she had been doing it for 3 years and no one had ever complained before. I told Ron that people had complained. I told him about the towing enforcement action 18 months ago and how half the street had filed disputes. I told him the management company had lost my dispute packet twice and that I had given up and paid the fine. Ron went quiet. Then he said he would look into it. I told him I needed an answer by Friday because that was when the records request deadline expired. He said he would do his best. I hung up and immediately called my friend. I told him Ron was stalling. My friend agreed. He said the board president did not want to admit that Stephanie had been running a scheme under his watch, so he was going to drag it out until I gave up. I asked what I should do. My friend said I should go to the management office in person and demand the folder. If they refused, I should file a public records request with the city, because HOA records were considered public in Washington if the HOA was incorporated. I checked the incorporation status. Riverbend Estates Association was incorporated. That meant the records were public. I drafted a public records request and emailed it to the city clerk. Then I drove to the management office. The management office was in a strip mall off Division Street, wedged between a nail salon and a tax prep service. The office was small, just 2 desks and a file cabinet. The manager was a woman in her 50s named Diane, and she looked up when I walked in. I introduced myself and told her I was there to pick up the folder from the towing enforcement action. Diane frowned. She said she did not have any folder for me. I told her the committee chair had said the folder was missing from the file cabinet. Diane looked confused. She said the file cabinet was locked and only Stephanie had the key. That was the second smoking gun. Stephanie controlled the records, and the records were incomplete. I asked Diane if she could call Stephanie and ask her to bring the folder. Diane shook her head. She said Stephanie did not come to the office unless there was a board meeting. I asked when the next board meeting was. Diane said Thursday night. I thanked her and left. Thursday night, I showed up at the board meeting. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a small building near the pool. I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the back row. Stephanie was already there, sitting at the front table with Ron and 2 other board members. She saw me immediately and walked over. She said I was not allowed to attend because of the obstruction fine. I told her the fine was retaliatory and illegal. She said she did not care what I thought, she cared what the rule said. There it was again. Ron stood up and walked over. He asked what was going on. I told him I was there to observe the meeting and to request a copy of the towing policy vote. Stephanie said I was banned. Ron looked uncomfortable. He said the obstruction fine was still pending, and I should wait outside until the board decided whether to allow me in. I asked when the board would decide. Ron said during the meeting. I asked how I could observe the meeting if I was outside. Ron did not answer. I sat down in the back row and did not move. Stephanie turned red. She said if I did not leave, she would call the police. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I said I was exercising my right to observe a meeting of a public HOA, and if she called the police, I would show them the retaliatory fine and the missing quorum logs. Stephanie looked at Ron. Ron looked at the floor. Then he sighed and said I could stay, but I could not speak during the meeting. The meeting started. The first item on the agenda was the approval of the previous meeting minutes. Ron read the minutes aloud. They were 2 pages long and covered landscaping, pool maintenance, and a vote to increase dues. There was no mention of quorum. I raised my hand. Ron ignored me. I raised my hand again. Ron sighed and asked what I wanted. I asked where the quorum log was. Ron said it was not required to be read aloud. I asked where it was filed. Stephanie said it was filed with the secretary. I asked to see it. Stephanie said no. That was when I stood up. I walked to the front of the room and placed my tabbed evidence binder on the table in front of Ron. I told him the binder contained the meeting minutes, the meeting videos, and the payment records for the towing enforcement action. I told him the minutes showed no vote on the towing policy, and the videos confirmed it. I told him the quorum logs were missing for every meeting in the past 2 years, which meant every vote was potentially invalid. I told him I had filed a public records request with the city, and if the city found the same gaps, the state attorney general would open an investigation. The room went silent. Ron opened the binder and started flipping through the pages. Stephanie stood up and said I was out of order and needed to sit down. I did not move. Ron kept reading. After a minute, he looked up at Stephanie and asked where the quorum log was for the August meeting. Stephanie said it was in the file cabinet. Ron asked why it was not attached to the minutes. Stephanie said it did not need to be attached. Ron asked who decided that. Stephanie said she did. Ron closed the binder. He looked at the other board members. He asked if anyone else had noticed the missing quorum logs. No one answered. Ron looked back at Stephanie. He asked if she had been uploading incomplete minutes. Stephanie said the minutes were complete. Ron asked where the quorum logs were. Stephanie said they were in the locked file cabinet. Ron asked for the key. Stephanie said no. That was the moment everything shifted. Ron stood up and said the meeting was adjourned until the quorum logs could be located and verified. Stephanie said he did not have the authority to adjourn without a vote. Ron said he was exercising his authority as board president, and if Stephanie did not cooperate, he would call an emergency meeting to remove her. Stephanie grabbed her coffee tumbler and her plastic evidence sleeve and walked out. The room erupted. Neighbors started asking questions, demanding answers, pointing at the binder. Ron held up his hands and said he would schedule a follow-up meeting within 2 weeks. I walked out of the clubhouse with the binder under my arm. The teen on the bike was outside, leaning against the fence. He gave me a thumbs up. I nodded and kept walking. My phone buzzed. It was my friend, the accountant. He said he had finished the ledger analysis and the numbers were damning. The HOA had collected over $30,000 in towing fines over the past 2 years, and none of it had been authorized by a board vote. He said if I wanted to take Stephanie down, I had everything I needed. I told him I wanted more than that. I wanted the whole system fixed. I wanted a clear enforcement policy with a neutral appeal process and proof standards. I wanted every fine refunded. I wanted Stephanie removed. My friend said that was a tall order. I said I knew, but I had a trump card. The trump card was a copy of the enforcement policy showing Stephanie was skipping required steps on purpose. I had found it buried in the portal, hidden in a folder labeled Archive. The policy was dated 2 years ago, and it required the board to approve every enforcement action by majority vote before any fine or tow could be issued. The policy also required a 30-day notice period and a written appeal process. Stephanie had been ignoring all of it. I had not told Ron about the trump card yet. I was waiting for the right moment. And the right moment was coming fast, because Stephanie had just escalated again. The next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA attorney. The letter said I was being sued for defamation, harassment, and interference with HOA operations. The lawsuit demanded $15,000 in damages and a permanent injunction barring me from attending meetings or filing complaints. If you love stories where the little guy fights back and wins, hit that like button and subscribe. I called my friend immediately. He said the lawsuit was a slap suit, designed to intimidate me into dropping the complaint. He said I should file a motion to dismiss and countersue for the refund of my towing fine. I asked if I needed a lawyer. He said yes. I asked how much that would cost. He said probably more than the fine. I told him I did not care. I was not backing down. I hired a lawyer the next day. Her name was Monica, and she specialized in HOA disputes. I gave her the binder, the ledger analysis, and the trump card policy. She read through everything in one sitting, then looked up at me and smiled. She said Stephanie had just made the biggest mistake of her career. She said the trump card policy was a smoking gun, and once we filed it with the court, the lawsuit would collapse. She said we should also file a counterclaim for the refund, plus attorney fees, plus punitive damages for the retaliatory fine. Monica filed the motion to dismiss and the counterclaim that afternoon. She also sent a copy to the management company, the board president, and the state attorney general. Then she sent a letter to Stephanie's attorney, offering to settle if Stephanie dropped the lawsuit, refunded my fine, and resigned from the board. The letter gave them 72 hours to respond. Stephanie's attorney did not respond. Instead, Stephanie showed up at my house the next morning with a tow truck. I was in the kitchen when I heard the diesel engine rumble up the street. I looked out the window and saw the truck pulling into my driveway. Stephanie was in her car behind it, coffee tumbler in hand. The tow driver got out and walked toward my friend's car. I ran outside. I told the driver to stop. He said he had an authorization from the HOA. I told him the authorization was invalid and that I had filed a lawsuit proving it. The driver shrugged. He said he was just doing his job. I told him I was putting him on notice that the tow was illegal, and if he proceeded, he would be named in the lawsuit. The driver stopped. He pulled out his phone and called his dispatcher. Stephanie got out of her car and walked over. She said the driver did not need my permission. She said the HOA had the authority to tow any vehicle in violation of the rules, and I had already been notified. I asked what rule. She pointed at my friend's car and said overnight guest parking required a pass. I asked where the pass rule was in the covenants. She said it was an administrative rule. I asked when it was voted on. She said it did not need to be voted on. I asked who had the authority to create administrative rules without a vote. She did not answer. The tow driver hung up and walked back to his truck. He said his dispatcher had put the tow on hold pending documentation from the HOA. Stephanie screamed at him. She said the documentation was in her car, and she would get it right now. She ran back to her car and pulled out a folder. She brought it to the driver and shoved it at him. The driver opened the folder and looked through the pages. Then he looked at me and said the documentation did not include a board vote. Stephanie said it did not need a board vote. The driver shook his head. He said his company policy required a board vote for any enforcement action, and without it, he was not proceeding. Stephanie's face went from red to purple. She screamed that she was canceling the contract and finding a new tow vendor. The driver shrugged, got in his truck, and drove away. Stephanie stood there in my driveway, breathing hard, coffee tumbler shaking in her hand. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of her. She saw the phone and screamed at me to delete it. I said no. She said she was calling the police. I said go ahead. Stephanie did not call the police. She got in her car and drove away. I stood there for a moment, watching her taillights disappear around the corner. Then I went inside and called Monica. I told her what had happened. She laughed. She said Stephanie had just given us another piece of evidence and we should add it to the counterclaim. She said she would file an amended complaint that afternoon. The amended complaint hit the court the next day. It included the tow truck incident, the missing quorum logs, the unvoted policies, the retaliatory fines, and the trump card enforcement policy. Monica attached the ledger analysis showing $30,000 in unauthorized fines. She also attached affidavits from 3 neighbors who had been targeted by Stephanie in the past. The complaint demanded a full refund of all fines, an injunction barring Stephanie from enforcement actions, and an order requiring the HOA to adopt a clear enforcement policy with a neutral appeal process and proof standards. 2 days later, Stephanie's attorney sent a settlement offer. The offer proposed dropping the defamation lawsuit in exchange for me dropping the counterclaim. Monica laughed when she read it. She said no. She said we were going to trial, and we were going to win. She sent a reply rejecting the offer and demanding a deposition of Stephanie within 30 days. The deposition was scheduled for the following Thursday at the courthouse. I met Monica in the hallway outside the deposition room. She was carrying a file cart stacked with binders, printouts, and evidence folders. She said she had spent the past week building a timeline of every enforcement action Stephanie had taken in the past 2 years, cross-referenced with the board meeting minutes and the quorum logs. She said the timeline showed a pattern of selective enforcement, backdating, and procedural violations. She said Stephanie was going to crack under questioning. We walked into the deposition room. Stephanie was already there with her attorney, sitting at the far end of the table. She had her coffee tumbler, her plastic evidence sleeve, and a fresh stack of printouts. She looked calm, but I could see her jaw clenched. Her attorney was a man in his 60s named Frank, and he looked like he had already decided this was a losing case. Monica started the deposition by asking Stephanie to confirm her role with the HOA. Stephanie said she was the vice president and had been for 3 years. Monica asked if Stephanie was responsible for uploading the board meeting minutes to the portal. Stephanie said yes. Monica asked if Stephanie was responsible for attaching the quorum logs to the minutes. Stephanie paused. She said the quorum logs were filed separately. Monica asked where. Stephanie said in the locked file cabinet. Monica asked why they were not attached to the minutes. Stephanie said it was not required. Monica pulled out a copy of the HOA bylaws and slid it across the table. She asked Stephanie to read Section 12, Paragraph 3. Stephanie read it silently, then looked up. Monica asked her to read it aloud. Stephanie hesitated, then read, "All board meeting minutes shall include a quorum log listing the members present and the votes cast." Monica asked if Stephanie had been following that requirement. Stephanie said yes. Monica asked where the quorum logs were. Stephanie said in the file cabinet. Monica asked Stephanie to produce them. Stephanie said she did not have the key with her. Monica smiled. She pulled a subpoena out of her file and slid it across the table. The subpoena required Stephanie to produce the file cabinet contents within 7 days. Stephanie's attorney objected. He said the subpoena was overly broad. Monica said it was specific and necessary. The court reporter typed everything. Frank looked at Stephanie. Stephanie looked at the subpoena. Then she said the file cabinet had been damaged in a flood 6 months ago, and some records were lost. That was the lie. Monica leaned forward. She asked when the flood had happened. Stephanie said March. Monica asked if Stephanie had reported the flood to the board. Stephanie said no. Monica asked why not. Stephanie said it was not significant. Monica asked how many records were lost. Stephanie said she did not know. Monica asked if the quorum logs were among the lost records. Stephanie said possibly. Monica pulled out another document. It was a work order from the clubhouse maintenance log, dated March 10th. The work order was for a leaking water heater, not a flood. Monica asked Stephanie to explain the discrepancy. Stephanie said the work order was incomplete. Monica asked if Stephanie was saying the maintenance log was wrong. Stephanie said yes. Monica asked if Stephanie had any documentation of the flood. Stephanie said no. Monica pulled out a third document. It was a printout from the HOA portal showing that Stephanie had uploaded minutes in April, May, and June, all without quorum logs. Monica asked if those minutes were uploaded after the flood. Stephanie said yes. Monica asked why Stephanie had not mentioned the missing logs in any of the uploaded minutes. Stephanie did not answer. Monica moved on. She asked Stephanie about the towing enforcement action from 18 months ago. She asked if the board had voted to authorize the policy. Stephanie said yes. Monica asked for the date of the vote. Stephanie said August. Monica pulled out the August meeting minutes and the video link. She asked Stephanie to show her where the vote appeared in the minutes. Stephanie flipped through the pages, then said the vote must have been in July. Monica pulled out the July minutes. There was no towing vote. Stephanie said it must have been in September. Monica pulled out September. No vote. Monica asked Stephanie if she was saying the towing policy was never voted on. Stephanie said no, she was saying the vote happened but was not recorded in the minutes. Monica asked why a vote would not be recorded. Stephanie said mistakes happen. Monica asked if Stephanie was the person responsible for recording the votes. Stephanie said yes. Monica asked how many other votes had Stephanie failed to record. Stephanie said she did not know. Monica paused. She looked at me, then back at Stephanie. She pulled out the trump card. It was a printout of the enforcement policy from the portal archive folder. The policy was dated 2 years ago and included a board signature page. Monica slid it across the table. She asked Stephanie if she recognized the document. Stephanie looked at it, then said yes. Monica asked if the policy required a board vote before any enforcement action. Stephanie read the page silently, then said yes. Monica asked if Stephanie had been following that requirement. Stephanie said yes. Monica pulled out the ledger analysis. She asked Stephanie to explain why the ledger showed $30,000 in fines collected over 2 years, but the meeting minutes showed no votes authorizing those fines. Stephanie said the votes were verbal and did not need to be in the minutes. Monica asked if verbal votes were allowed under the bylaws. Stephanie said yes. Monica asked Stephanie to show her where in the bylaws verbal votes were allowed. Stephanie flipped through the bylaws, then said she could not find it right now. Monica leaned back. She asked Stephanie if she understood that failure to follow the enforcement policy was a breach of fiduciary duty. Stephanie said she had not breached anything. Monica asked if Stephanie understood that collecting fines without board authorization was potentially fraud. Stephanie's attorney objected. Monica withdrew the question. The deposition ended 20 minutes later. Stephanie left without looking at me. Her attorney stayed behind and asked Monica if we would consider a settlement. Monica said yes if the settlement included a full refund of all fines, Stephanie's resignation, and the adoption of a new enforcement policy. Frank said he would talk to his client. 2 days later, Frank sent a revised settlement offer. The offer included a refund of my towing fine, an apology letter, and a promise that Stephanie would not personally enforce any rules against me for 1 year. Monica rejected it. She said we wanted the full refund for everyone, not just me. Frank said that was not realistic. Monica said then we would see him in court. The trial was scheduled for 6 weeks later, but it never happened. 3 weeks before the trial date, the state attorney general opened an investigation into Riverbend Estates Association, based on the public records request I had filed with the city. The investigation found that the HOA had been operating without proper quorum logs for over 2 years, that multiple enforcement actions had been taken without board votes, and that the management company had failed to maintain adequate records. The Attorney General issued a cease and desist order barring the HOA from collecting any fines or fees until the records were audited and corrected. The cease and desist order triggered panic. Ron called an emergency board meeting and invited me to attend. I showed up with Monica and my friend, the accountant. The meeting was packed. Every neighbor on our street was there, along with a dozen others from around the community. Ron opened the meeting by reading the Attorney General's letter aloud. Then he turned to Stephanie and asked her to explain. Stephanie stood up. She had her coffee tumbler and her plastic evidence sleeve, but her hands were shaking. She said the Attorney General was overreacting and the records were fine. Ron asked her to produce the quorum logs. Stephanie said they were in the file cabinet. Ron asked for the key. Stephanie said she had lost it. Ron asked when she had lost it. Stephanie said recently. Ron asked how recently. Stephanie did not answer. A neighbor in the front row stood up. He said he had been fined $200 last year for a landscaping violation, and he wanted to know if that fine was authorized. Another neighbor stood up and said the same thing. Then another. Within minutes, half the room was standing, demanding refunds. Ron tried to restore order, but it was too late. The room was in chaos. Monica stood up and asked to speak. Ron nodded. Monica said she represented multiple homeowners who had been targeted by unauthorized fines, and she was prepared to file a class action lawsuit if the board did not take immediate action. She said the action should include a full audit of the past 2 years, a refund of all unauthorized fines, and the removal of any board member who had participated in the scheme. She looked directly at Stephanie. Ron asked the board to vote on whether to authorize the audit. 3 board members voted yes. Stephanie voted no. The audit was authorized. Ron then asked the board to vote on whether to suspend Stephanie pending the results of the audit. 2 board members voted yes. 1 abstained. Stephanie screamed that the vote was invalid because there was no quorum. Ron pulled out the bylaws and read the quorum requirement aloud. 4 board members were present. The quorum was 3. The vote was valid. Stephanie was suspended. Stephanie grabbed her things and walked out. The room erupted in applause. Ron asked everyone to sit down. He said the board would hire an independent auditor to review the records, and the results would be published within 60 days. He said any homeowner who believed they had been fined improperly could file a claim with the management company, and the claims would be reviewed as part of the audit. He said the board would also draft a new enforcement policy with a neutral appeal process and proof standards, and the policy would be voted on at the next meeting. I raised my hand. Ron called on me. I asked if the new policy would require board votes for all enforcement actions. Ron said yes. I asked if the policy would include a 30-day notice period. Ron said yes. I asked if the policy would include a written appeal process with an independent reviewer. Ron hesitated, then said he would add that to the draft. The meeting ended an hour later. I walked out with Monica and my friend. The teen on the bike was outside again, leaning against the fence. He gave me a high five. I laughed. My friend said I should celebrate, but I told him it was not over yet. The audit still had to be completed, and Stephanie could still fight back. But Stephanie did not fight back. 2 weeks later, she resigned from the board. Her resignation letter was 1 sentence long and included no explanation. The board accepted it without comment. The audit was completed 4 weeks later. The results were devastating. The auditor found that over 50 enforcement actions had been taken without board votes, that the quorum logs were missing for 23 meetings, and that the HOA had collected $42,000 in unauthorized fines. The auditor recommended full refunds for all affected homeowners, plus interest. The board voted to accept the auditor's recommendations. Refund checks were mailed within 30 days. I received a check for $250, plus $18 in interest. My friend received a check for $150. A dozen other neighbors received checks ranging from $50 to $500. The total refund was over $42,000, paid out of the HOA's reserve fund. The new enforcement policy was adopted at the next board meeting. The policy required a board vote for all enforcement actions, a 30-day notice period, a written appeal process with an independent reviewer, and proof standards for all violations. The policy also included a provision barring any board member from personally enforcing rules without board authorization. The policy passed unanimously. But the story did not end there. 3 months later, I received a letter from Stephanie's attorney. The letter said Stephanie was dropping the defamation lawsuit and would not contest the counterclaim. The letter included a settlement agreement. The agreement required Stephanie to pay my attorney fees, issue a formal apology, and agree to a permanent injunction barring her from serving on any HOA board in Washington state. Monica said it was a good deal. I signed it. The apology letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was typed, single-spaced, and 1 paragraph long. Stephanie wrote that she regretted any inconvenience her actions had caused and that she had resigned from the board to pursue other opportunities. She did not admit wrongdoing. She did not acknowledge the missing quorum logs or the unauthorized fines, but she signed her name at the bottom, and that was enough. I framed the letter and hung it in my kitchen, right next to the refund check stub. My friend said I should let it go, but I told him I wanted the reminder. I wanted to remember that gray areas equal HOA power grabs, and that the only way to stop power grabs is to force transparency. The final piece of the story came 6 months later. The board held a special meeting to review the new enforcement policy and solicit feedback. I attended with Monica and my friend. The meeting was calm, orderly, and boring. The policy was working. Enforcement actions were being voted on. Appeals were being heard. Proof was being required. The HOA was functioning the way it was supposed to. At the end of the meeting, Ron stood up and thanked everyone for their patience during the audit and the transition. He said the board had learned a valuable lesson about accountability and transparency. He said the community was stronger now because people had demanded better. Then he looked at me and said thank you. I nodded. I did not need thanks. I needed the system to work, and now it did. The coldest part of the cold case was not the missing folder or the forged minutes. It was the fact that no one had questioned Stephanie for 3 years. She had been moving goalposts, backdating paperwork, and skipping votes, and everyone had just assumed she was following the rules because she said she was. I do not care what you think, I care what the rule says. That was her line, and she had used it to bully an entire community into silence. But the rule only works if everyone follows it, and the moment someone forces you to prove you are following the rule, the whole scheme collapses. That is what happened to Stephanie. I forced her to prove it, and she could not. The quorum logs did not exist. The votes did not happen. The fines were unauthorized, and once the proof was on the table, her credibility collapsed in front of witnesses. The funniest part was the karma. Stephanie had spent years using her stopwatch and ruler routine to catch people in tiny violations. She would walk the neighborhood with a measuring tape, checking fence heights and mailbox placements. She would time how long cars were parked on the street and issue fines to the minute. She was obsessed with precision. And in the end, it was precision that destroyed her. The timestamp mismatch on the enforcement letter, the metadata creation date on the policy document, the missing quorum log entries. Every tiny detail she had ignored came back to bite her. At the final board meeting where the refunds were announced, a neighbor in the back row stood up and asked if Stephanie's measuring tape and stopwatch would be auctioned off as surplus equipment. The room erupted in laughter. Even Ron smiled. Stephanie was not there to hear it, but I like to think someone told her. The HOA voted to require actual evidence before fines, which meant every enforcement action now had to include photographs, timestamps, and witness statements. The board also voted to require a third-party reviewer for all appeals, which meant no one could be judge, jury, and executioner anymore. The changes were not perfect, but they were real. And they happened because I used a procedural complaint to force the HOA to redo the vote properly. Karen's credibility collapsed in front of witnesses. That was the part that mattered most. It was not enough to win in court or get a refund. People needed to see what she had been doing. They needed to understand that the rules she had weaponized were fake, and once they saw it, they could not unsee it. Stephanie's name became a punchline in the neighborhood. People would joke about getting Stephanied whenever the HOA sent a notice. The measuring tape and stopwatch became symbols of petty tyranny, and no one wanted to be associated with them. The custody and visitation routine I had been protecting throughout the whole ordeal finally stabilized. The HOA stopped targeting my schedule and guests because there was no one left to do the targeting. Stephanie was gone. The new board members were reasonable. The enforcement policy required proof, which meant no more phantom violations appearing out of nowhere. My friend, the accountant, kept digging through the HOA ledger even after the audit was finished. He found patterns that suggested Stephanie had been skimming administrative fees for years. He brought the findings to Ron, who forwarded them to the state attorney general. I do not know what happened after that. The attorney general does not share details of ongoing investigations. But I heard from a neighbor that Stephanie moved out of Riverbend Estates 6 months after the refunds were issued. No one saw her pack, no one saw her leave. She was just gone one day. The teen on the bike became a bit of a legend in the neighborhood. People called him the witness because he had recorded so many of Stephanie's confrontations. He ended up testifying in 2 other HOA disputes, both involving selective enforcement. The board invited him to present at a community meeting about the importance of documentation. He showed up with his phone and his bike and gave a 5-minute talk about always recording when someone in authority is yelling at you. The room gave him a standing ovation. Monica, my lawyer, used the case as a teaching example in a seminar she gave on HOA law. She told me later that the seminar was packed and half the attendees were homeowners who were dealing with their own Stephanies. She said the case had resonated because it showed that you do not need to be rich or connected to fight back. You just need to be stubborn and organized. I told her stubborn was the easy part. Organized was harder. The management company, the one that had lost my dispute packet twice, was eventually replaced. The board voted to hire a new company with a digital record system and an audit trail. The new company required every enforcement action to be logged in the portal with timestamps and supporting documentation. It was not perfect, but it was a huge improvement. Diane, the old office manager, retired. I do not know if she was forced out or if she left on her own. Either way, she was gone. The locked file cabinet that Stephanie had controlled for 3 years was eventually opened by a locksmith. The board authorized the locksmith after Stephanie resigned and refused to turn over the key. Inside the cabinet, they found stacks of incomplete records, missing quorum logs, and a folder labeled archive that contained draft enforcement policies Stephanie had written but never brought to a vote. They also found a ledger with handwritten notes that did not match the official HOA ledger. The board turned everything over to the Attorney General. I never found out what happened with that investigation either. Ron served out his term as board president and did not run for re-election. He told me privately that the Stephanie situation had burned him out, and he did not want the responsibility anymore. He said he had trusted her because she seemed competent and organized, and he had learned the hard way that competence and integrity are not the same thing. I told him I appreciated his honesty, and I was glad he had supported the audit. He said it was the least he could do. The new board president is a retired engineer named Paul, and he runs the meetings like an engineering project review. Every agenda item has a timeline, a budget, and a decision matrix. Enforcement actions are tracked in a spreadsheet with color-coded status indicators. It is not exciting, but it works. The HOA has not issued a single unauthorized fine since Paul took over. The enforcement policy that I fought so hard for has been amended twice since it was first adopted. Both amendments were voted on at open meetings with full quorum logs attached to the minutes. The first amendment added a provision requiring photographic evidence for all landscaping violations. The second amendment added a cap on administrative fees. Both amendments passed unanimously. I still live in Riverbend Estates. I still go to board meetings occasionally, mostly to make sure the new policies are being followed. I still keep my evidence binder in the kitchen, just in case. But I have not needed it. The system works now. The rules are clear. The enforcement is fair. The appeals are heard. And no one is skipping steps on purpose. The coldest lesson I learned from the cold case is that institutions only stay honest when people force them to. The moment you stop checking, the moment you stop asking questions, the moment you stop demanding proof, that is the moment the gray areas turn into power grabs. Stephanie thrived in the gray areas for 3 years because no one made her prove what she was doing was legal. And the moment I made her prove it, the whole scheme fell apart. I will see you in the next HOA story.